Hey, we're here, session 1 of the spring of 2020, looking at the book of Romans. What a great chapter we got today, chapter 1. Actually, the next 2 weeks will be chapter 1. What a tremendous passage. Excited about going through this, excited about going through the book of Romans with you. I'm looking forward to what God's going to do through this as you teach and as God really deepens your walk with Him and helps you to help others understand God's gospel and understand how God has moved and worked and how He brings us to salvation, how He pours out His righteousness in our life, and how we come to Him by faith. So I'm looking forward to what God's going to do as we go through this whole quarter in Romans, the book of Romans. Today we start in chapter 1. We're going to start at the very beginning. Might as well start there, right? Let's go to verse 1 and see what God has to say there. Paul writes, Paul, a servant of Christ Jesus, called as an apostle and set apart for the gospel of God. He is called to share the gospel. He says, I'm called as an apostle and set apart for the gospel of God. And you know, the reality is we're all set apart for the gospel, right? We're all called to that. We all are servants of Christ. We share in common with Paul that we're servants, that we are set apart for the gospel, that God has called us to take the gospel to the world. We cannot, should not, must not ever give that to somebody else. Say, oh, that's their call, it's not my call. No, everyone is called. All of us are set apart to take the gospel to the world. And then verse 5, he says, through Him, that is through Christ, we have received grace and apostleship to bring about the obedience of faith for the sake of His name among all the Gentiles. Paul is laying out here as he introduces himself to the church in Rome, his calling and what God has done in his life. And he talks about, says, through Him we've received grace and apostleship, that is the calling to bring about the obedience of faith for the sake of His name among all the Gentiles. There's so much here. This grace, right? We've received grace. That's grace. That's what allows us to be a part of God's work. God allows us to be a part of His work. What grace! That God would even use us, that God would deign to give us that opportunity. Wow, we're so blessed by God's grace to be the ones who can take the gospel. What a blessing that is. And that we're called by His grace, not by our birth. Our apostleship is not because Paul was born into the right family. He was. His apostleship is because of God's grace. For all of us, it is true that we're not who we are. We're not called to do that because we have some sort of great lineage that qualifies us. No, we have the grace of God who has called us. He loved us. So we're called by grace, not because of our history, because of our family, because of our education, because of our experience or any of that. Everyone is qualified because of God's grace. That's what qualifies us, is grace. And our job is to bring about obedience of faith. You see that? See this? To bring about the obedience of faith. You know, sometimes people try to separate those two things, don't they? Obedience and faith. No, they are intertwined completely. You cannot separate obedience and faith. They go together completely. We're obedient because we're faithful. We're faithful and obedient. Both of these two things happen. If you're not obedient, you're not being faithful. You know, sometimes what we need to do is just trust God and be obedient. Sometimes we need to obey God and just say, okay, God, whatever, I'll have faith because I'm going to follow you. I'm just going to do it. We're obedient and faithful. It's a great phrase. And then the other thing here is this clear call to the Gentiles, the sake of His name among all the Gentiles. That was Paul's clear, specific call to go to the Gentiles. In Rome, mostly Gentiles. So most of the people he's going to be talking to as he's writing to are Gentiles. You won't see a lot. There is some here about Israel in the book, but his focus is on the Gentiles, explaining to them how they fit into the gospel story. Okay, then we go to verse 14 and 15. Paul says this, I am obligated both to Greeks and barbarians, both to the wise and the foolish, so I am eager to preach the gospel to you who also are in Rome. Paul is eager to preach the gospel because he has been called by God. You see this? Obligated? I'm obligated. God's call on him has obligated him. He must go. That is a call from God. He's got to go. Right? And to this audience in particular, it's interesting to me that he says to the Greeks and the barbarians. He doesn't say to the Greeks and the Jews. He says the Greeks and barbarians. This was his particular call to the Greeks and the barbarians, those who'd never heard, those who had no background, those who had no history. This was his call. I want you to think about when Paul goes to those places, those people who have no history with the gospel, no history with the covenant of God, no history with the Old Testament. He's really starting from behind scratch, right? Below scratch. He's got, it's a hard thing. It's a lot easier to talk to somebody about Christ if they've got some kind of a background in the church, if they have some history of being involved in religion somehow, but, in the church background, maybe when they were kids or something. But everybody Paul dealt with had none of that. And the truth is, today there are more and more people like that. We find ourselves very much in a first century kind of a world where there are so many people who have no church background, who don't know anything about the gospel. And we need to understand that the gospel did really well in the first century, so it can do really well in the 21st century, because it's not dependent upon people having a background for them to come to faith. These were most of the people that Paul worked with had no background, and yet they came to faith. So don't think that because you're talking to people who have no background, well, there's no way they'll ever come to faith. No, they will. It happened in the first century. It can happen in the 21st. And then we also see that Paul, he's eager to preach the gospel to you. He wants to come to Rome. This is where he wanted to go. Rome was the center of the civilized world. So there's good reason for him wanting to be in Rome, because Paul's general strategy is, if you look at what he was trying to do, is he would go to the city centers and start a church, and then the city and that center would then go out to the neighboring areas, the small places, and start churches in those places. So he went to Philippi, for instance, then to Thessaloniki, then to Berea, and then to Athens, and then to Corinth, these city centers. He's starting a church there, and then depending on those churches to go and reach the people in the small areas, the smaller towns. And if you're going to go, go to Rome, because that's the center of the universe right there at that time, right? So he wants to get to Rome. Okay, now let's look at these key passages. In verse 16, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God." The gospel is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, just as it is written, "The righteous will live by faith." Paul says, I am not ashamed. I will not be silent. I will not be ashamed. I will not act as if I am ashamed. I will speak boldly. This is what we believe. This is it. I'm going to speak it out. I'm not going to be ashamed of the gospel, because the gospel is the power of God. The gospel is the power of God. The gospel does not release the power of God. The gospel is not about the power of God. The gospel is the power of God. It is the revelation of God's work, the revelation of God's love, the revelation of God's plan, His desire, the revelation of God's personhood, His hopes, His vision for us is all found in the gospel. And there is no power without the gospel. Without the gospel, there's no power, but the gospel in and of itself is the power of God. And this power of God that gets released in the world comes when we share the gospel. It is salvation for everyone who believes. Everyone who believes, universal. Anyone can come to faith when hearing the gospel. This is the heart of the passage. In some ways, the heart of the whole book is right here in 16 and 17. The theme of Romans is right here in 16 and 17, right? So we want to spend time, when you're teaching here, spend time. This is where the bulk of this needs to be, in 16 and 17, spending time in this passage and understanding what it says, because this is the power of the book right here. If we don't get this, we're not going to get the rest of the book. Then he says, for in it, that is in the gospel, for in it, the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. We see God's righteousness in the gospel. We're going to talk about that more when we get to chapter 3. Excuse me, but just to kind of a brief little touch here, okay? God's rightness, God's goodness, God's greatness, God's holiness, God's integrity, God's truth to Himself is revealed in the gospel, that God is not going to sacrifice or give up on His righteousness in bringing us to salvation, but He will fulfill His righteousness in bringing us to salvation. He does not excuse our sin. He pays for our sin by sending his son Jesus to die on a cross. This is the righteousness of God revealed. And so, he says, the righteous live by faith. Always have been this way. The righteous have always lived by faith. This is the theme of Romans. It is not by the law, it is by faith. This is the passage, verse 117 of Romans is the passage that in 1517 spoke to Luther, brought him to salvation, and eventually led to him putting the thesis on the wall there in Wittenberg, Germany, that led to the Protestant Reformation. It's a quotation of Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 4. This truth, the righteous live by faith. This is the gospel. It's the heart of it. Well, I hope this has helped you as you get prepared to teach. Thanks for being a part of what God's doing in your church. Thanks for being a part of what's happening. I hope it helps you as you teach God's word and bring it to others. May God bless you. We'll talk to you next time.